Thank you for your patience. There's some traffic jam out there, and Berlin Underground is not running well, as you know, but you're all here. So good evening and welcome to the Literaturhaus Berlin. My name is Sonja Longolius. I'm the co-director of this beautiful place. We are currently here in Moabit because our house at Fasanenstraße is under renovations. Hopefully until next summer, we will let you know. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to a very special evening, part of the Berlin Freedom Week, which has started this Saturday and will feature more than 130 events and over 80 venues until next Saturday. It's a whole week of many events that you can all visit. The Berlin Freedom Week celebrates the 36th anniversary of the fall of the wall in Berlin, and, which is also very important, hosts the World Liberty Congress that brings together dissidents and activists for democracy from all over the world. It's the first time it is here in Berlin, so it's a very special occasion. And we are very happy to be part of this, completely according to the title of today's book, the graphic novel You Must Take Part in Revolution by Badiucao and Melissa Chan. With their debut graphic novel, they have created a fascinating future dystopian book around their three main characters, Andy, Maggie, and Olivia. They are all based in Hong Kong, or in the beginning they're based in Hong Kong, who struggle between a proto-fascist United States and a totalitarian China in war with each other over Taiwan. And did I say future narrative, or should we rather say near future dystopia? Well, we will leave this question to clarify tonight for tonight's moderator, a dear friend of the Literaturhaus Berlin, Jakob Scherer, the executive director of the Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House. However, that's not a question. Beyond any doubt, Melissa Chan's and Badiucao's graphic novel is a mind-blowing read and a real aesthetic experience. And I'm very happy that you can experience it here today. So please give a revolutionary round of applause to tonight's guests and enjoy the evening. Thank you. Please welcome.
Lights are really bright.
So, welcome, dear guests, to tonight's conversation on You Must Take Part in Revolution. By the way, if you can't hear me properly, please let me know. My name is Jakob Scherer, as Sonja just mentioned. By the way, thank you, Sonja, for the very, very kind introduction. I work as the managing director of Villa Aurora and Thomas Mann House, an institution based in Los Angeles and Berlin, which is where I know Melissa Chan from. And I've also spent formative years of my life in Hong Kong, from the ages of 9 to almost 17. And so I believe that's probably one of the reasons why you two asked me to moderate tonight's conversation. And I have to say, it's a great honor to be able to do so. It's a topic that's very close to my heart, and I would just like to state before starting the conversation that during the lecture or the reading of the novel and afterwards, there was a real sadness in me because I had to reflect on some of the memories of my past and some of the things that I have lost living there as a teenager, but also because I feel it's a very dire state of the world that you're describing to us. For those of you who haven't had the chance to read the novel, it's a gripping and provocative thriller. I would say it has a compelling and spectacular pictorial language that you will find, and we will take a look at some of the panels and the drawing later on. And in essence, it deals with such important topics as friendship, trust, loyalty, and betrayal in the most challenging of times, namely during insurgencies, violence, and war. And at the same time, I would say, if you ask me to summarize it in one sentence, It's about the battle for the soul of modern China. What is China, and where would we locate modern China? And above all, who is the bearer of its rich cultural traditions? And it's one of the themes that we will also talk about later on. And I have to say, that's a lot of topics to deal with in one graphic novel, but you really manage in a spectacular way. So give a round of applause to the two authors, Melissa Chan and Badiucao. Melissa, you're an Emmy-nominated Hong Kong Taiwanese American foreign correspondent. Let's talk later about what foreign in that construct of a sentence still means. You work on issues such as human rights, the rise of authoritarianism, and the state of democracy. You yourself were expelled by the Chinese government in 2012 after doing your work as a journalist and a correspondent there. And in other words, I would say you have gained an in-depth look into what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the mainland China are capable of. And at some point, the two of you decided to collaborate. Badiucao, who's responsible for the aesthetic picture that we find in the novel. You're a Chinese-Australian artist, activist, and cartoonist. You were born and raised in mainland China and exhibited around the world and live in exile right now. And as you told me before tonight's conversation, your identity, or you were working anonymously in the past, your identity was revealed by Chinese agents coming to visit your family and telling them that if you don't stop doing what you're doing, that they're actually going to be exposed to repercussions by the Chinese government. And you've also worked in Berlin for Ai Weiwei, so I forgot to say, you're based in Berlin right now, so the two of you have a strong connection to the city. And I would say let's just jump right into it. Are you ready? Are you guys ready? Yes. Wonderful. How and when did you decide to collaborate, and what did your daily routine look like when you were working on the novel? Melissa, go ahead.
So we started working on this 5 years ago, around the time of the COVID lockdown. So from my perspective, I was in California under lockdown with my parents at the time in my childhood home, and I was looking at my bookshelf of old graphic novels. So I was sort of rediscovering an old love, and I was in this headspace. At the same time, this was sort of the tail end of the 2019-2020 protests in Hong Kong as a result of COVID. And so a lot of that was going on in my mind. Now, we didn't know each other very well when we started working on this, and I joke it could have gone really pear-shaped, but it didn't. But I had interviewed Badiucao earlier, about a year earlier, I think, because I was working on a piece for The Atlantic about Chinese exiles in Berlin. The fact that so many young people were showing up. It was something I just organically noticed. Filmmakers, writers, poets, visual artists who didn't see a future career long-term in Xi Jinping's China. And so Berlin, as it has been for quite a number of times in history, became a hub, and I interviewed him. That's how I met him. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but at some point I just reached out to him and asked him, because I'd seen so much of his political art and cartooning, like, have you thought of doing sequential art? So I'll just leave it at that, and then hand it over to you and your version of the story.
Sure. For me, it was really a great pleasure to be able to work with Melissa, because I'm a political cartoonist. I do paintings and installation for museum, but I always have a dream to creating something like sequential art. That is partially because my very family history. My great-parents, my grandparents' brother were actually the first generation filmmakers, being very active in China. They were like celebrities like Brad Pitt in the 1930s in Shanghai. But lately, after the Communist Party is in power, they didn't choose to go to Hong Kong or Taiwan, but decided to stay because they were so successful that they think that they will be immune to the purge because they are the number one. However, the world didn't operate in that way, and both of them got impacted by the the so-called 100 Blossom Movement, 1957, which is a purge against artists and intellectuals. So both of them died. And as I grow up, that I look up to them, right? They are still the stars. And now they are actually being celebrated again in China because they are the figures that you cannot going around if the Chinese government want to talk about the history of China's film. So for me, I always want to, kind of fill their shoes to creating something close to the form of film. And obviously, I think a graphic novel, a manga that have this idea of storyboard and the conversation is a form very close to our language of filmmaking. Thus, when Melissa was, asking if I'm interested, I'm like, sure, I'm 100% in. This is my dream, being a long time.
So what did your daily working routine or weekly working routine
So
look
on a
like?
practical level, we were literally on 2 separate continents, and we were able to meet maybe 2 times in person at, 2 times, I think, over the course of 5 years in person to get some work done face to face. But in general, it was completely remote. So there was a time zone issue for, I think, a solid 2 years. If you couldn't meet me for lunch, it was because lunchtime was always around evening time in Australia. And so I would be there to have the meeting and call. At one point when we were really in the final stretch or the last year of working on this book, I think we spoke to each other once every 24 hours. And it is like making a film because, first of all, we plotted out everything. And by the way, you'll notice that it's not written by Melissa Chan, illustrated by Badiucao. This is deliberate. We are equal co-authors. We had to get each other's buy-in for the plot, the characters, the world building, everything. And we wrote it out in sort of a prose form, and then we broke it down into scenes, and then broke it into a sort of screenplay format where obviously he drew this out, it's also obvious I did first pass on the writing, but, just sort of break out the panels and the dialogue. But I would also take a piece of paper and draw stick figures for the page because there's so much you can describe via text, and that way Badiucao can see the dialogue and see what I was thinking about in terms of flow, what was going on in my head. And it's been so interesting because he is the artist, he is the creative. I've had to learn a new way of thinking about aesthetics and art and learn that language. Then he would send a sketch back, a counter proposal. Sometimes he would say, 5 panels is too much, I just need 3, or on this page I need 8. You can't have this mid-shot that you're suggesting with the stick figure, you need to do something else. So we would negotiate that, and this is a 264-page novel, but there's a 264-page version of my stick figures. There's a 264-page version of his sketch version, and then this is the final. And in each step of the way, including the text version, we worked with an editor as well. So, yeah.
So by the way, I will just start flipping through the panels as you two speak. I don't think I would like us to talk about every single drawing that we look at, just would like to get you, I would like you to have a kind of a general impression of what the novel looks like. At what point did you decide that Hong Kong is kind of one of the key places for the novel to happen, and what does Hong Kong represent in the course of your graphic novel?
I think both of us, our life has a very deep root of connection with Hong Kong. For me personally, as Jakob mentioned, that in the very early time when I become an artist, I choose to be anonymous. I do not really show my face. I wouldn't, appear in such occasion to giving a talk without wearing a mask, and that's how careful I was. But just 3 days before my first solo exhibition opened in Hong Kong, a group of Chinese National Security Police went to my hometown in Shanghai and took my relatives to the police station, and basically saying, we know who Badiucao is, and we want the show to be cancelled in Hong Kong, and we want you to stop making art. That was probably the hardest moment of my life. I have to make a decision between the safety of my family, and my dream to be an artist, to create freely. I'm very glad that I choose the path to stick with art, but also showing my face now. To some extent, I shall thank to the Chinese government that making me step out from the political closet. But yeah, it was not an easy decision. And because of that, my life internally connecting with Hong Kong since that. And also during the time that I got attacked, that I received a lot of support from Hong Kong. That unfortunately after the show was cancelled due to a lot of threat, not just to me, but also to the people who were working with me in Hong Kong, that Hong Kong citizens print out my works and paste up around the city to make the show continuous even without its opening. And lately, the Hong Kong protest happened. And that was the time I finally made this decision to reappear with my face. So I drawing Hong Kong's protest in a daily basis and put everything online, free for downloading. And what's the best experience for me as an artist is, the night I draw something that is according to the development of the movement, the very day when they parade on the street, my work is already printed out and march in the city. And now, it feels like the whole fucking city become my gallery. And this show cannot be shutting down. So that's how close for me to my life towards this very city. But of course, when the protests eventually dying down because of the cracking down, because the weather, also because of COVID, that it leaves a scar in my heart. And I want to somehow use a art expression in a form of this graphic novel to imagine what if the protest never ended? What if the protests go more fierce and go further?
Melissa, how about you? Would you like to talk a little bit about your biographical connection to Hong Kong?
Yeah, I was born in Hong Kong, so obviously the protests meant a lot to me, and I was watching it and feeling quite helpless. Actually, I see that you have this page up. We did a little bit of, there are Easter eggs in this book, and there's an Easter egg on this page, I should say. There's an Alfred Hitchcock thing where I'm in this book, so you can look for it. But here I am, if you can find me.
Yeah.
But it's because I wasn't at the protests. And I've always felt very guilty as a reporter that I didn't go and cover it. And so when it came time to draw this, I said to Badiucao, can you put me in the protests? Not as a protester, because I'm always a journalist first, but as a reporter reporting on this. So you see me with my little reporter's notebook. And I didn't make the real thing, but I made it in a parallel universe. And so, yeah, it is meaningful for both of us, Hong Kong. And that's why we started with one chapter on Hong Kong. But as you know, most of the book is actually not based in Hong Kong. And that was also deliberate because the conversation needed to move on. We are also very aware of representation. I'm born there, but there are Hong Kongers who would not consider me a Hong Konger just because I left when I was 3. So I tried to be mindful and respectful of the people who actually participated in the movement. And so we were very careful about not over-representing and sort of even potentially accidentally suggesting that we would be speaking for this group of people.
Mm-hmm. So, as you can see, and as you probably know, the protests were clamped down violently in 2019. And at one of the rallies, our 3 main characters meet, kind of by accident, Andy, Maggie, and Olivia. And after the granny, Maggie is one of the characters, her grandmother stumbles and I think breaks an arm. They take her to the hospital and the 3 become friends. And I would say that that's probably the only scene where people are enjoying themselves in the whole novel. Maybe there's 2, 3 others, but this I think is a very quintessential scene because they talk so much about...
It's very perceptive of you. I hadn't thought about that.
Am I right, or what would you say?
I think so, yeah. I think so. It just dawned on me, so.
Tell us a little bit about where Andy, Maggie, and Olivia are from, and how their biographies matter for the development of the novel.
I'll start because I was just talking about representation. So there's 3 protagonists, and Andy is Asian American, and so it aligns sort of to my identity in some ways. And Maggie is from Hong Kong, and that's a little bit of my Hong Kong identity, where I was born. And then Olivia, I will hand over to you, and you can also, of course, comment about the other 2 characters. But we were thinking about this sort of identity and representation when we were building these characters.
Yeah, every character that we created had a trace of our own life experience. I do particularly in favor of Olivia because she was born in China, like I am, and we have this character in order to showing a more complicated picture of a teenager that grow up in China and what kind of difficulty and struggle that we have to face, even if we change our living space and go into democracy, a free world. But the change wouldn't happen overnight. It requires a lot of change. I tell you this one thing. I'm actually on the path of being a lawyer in China. I study in a law school in China. And as far as I know, one of my classmates who living in the same dormitory with me become a national security police. And I'm always thinking maybe he's the one who's in charge of my case now. He's flipping my profile every day. But that could be my past as well if I didn't choose art, if I didn't leave China and go to Australia. So Olivia is very much reflecting on this very struggle, that there are different paths laying in front of every teenager that grow up in China. It is not easy to be changed, to be able to see the world in different perspective. But not easy does not mean not possible. And this possibility are the essence that we try to discover and analyze and reveal within the developments for our character in the books.
And all 3, I mean, I know there's more characters, obviously. We might be talking about I think he's an intelligence officer who's somehow friends with the father of Olivia, but all 3 somehow have been affected in one way or the other by political violence of the 20th century. I mean, Olivia's father, as part of the Communist Party, dies during the 4th of June movement, 1989 in Beijing. The grandmother of Maggie is a victim of the Cultural Revolution. She fled China, and Andy's parents were on the protesters' side during the 4th of June. So all of them are somehow dealing with what the political and historical violence in the 20th century China meant for them and for their family in that very particular scene. I mean, only Olivia doesn't want to talk about her past. She tries to evade it a bit. Would you agree that that's something that kind of ties the 3 together in some way, in one way or the other?
Definitely. I mean, we're all product of history, and we're different because we make maybe different choices, but also because, we're lucky. I mean, I mentioned my great-parents' journey, that they didn't decide to go to Taiwan or Hong Kong because they think they are so successful, but they were wrong. And they're just this little grain of sand in front of this mountain of history. And a single mistake could cause the entire destiny of family. And now this tragedy, this shadow of being persecuted, is passing down generations after generations, even to me now, being threatened by the Chinese government 24/7. So yeah, it's very much, I feel that all our life is somehow tightening with this grand tendency in the country, whether you try to fight it or not. But still, there are differences can be made.
And what are the decisions that the 3 are facing in 2019 as the novel starts to develop? And what brings them together? What tears them apart?
Wow, that's a big one. I would say that each character has to struggle with what resistance means to them. And that is a big theme of the book. In some ways it's an old theme, right? One simple binary is nonviolent versus violent resistance, but it keeps coming up in novels, in films, so we know that it's something that people constantly have to grapple with. I would say that we didn't quite expect the timing of the novel to come out this year particularly. We started working on this somewhat after near the end of the first Trump presidency, and I don't think I could have quite predicted all the things that have happened in this year. So yeah, but it is a theme, and when we were traveling across the United States talking, a lot of Americans were asking Badiucao, and we made a joke about it, like, what, all these Americans asking the Chinese dude for help on fighting democracy. But it is something that we struggle with. There are no clear answers. I don't know, I think I'm giving away anything about the book. In many ways, again, we're coming from very different sort of backgrounds, but I interviewed so many Chinese activists and dissidents when I was a reporter in China. They're either in jail or in exile or dead. And so you would talk to them and they would give you the quote on camera or whatever you needed. But what I was observing is, the quote will appear in an Associated Press, wire, and they're saying something critical about the Chinese state. But there's this whole life to these dissidents that don't really get covered unless it's a profile. There is such a toll on the family that I think doesn't get covered. And there's a certain loneliness to being you choose to be a martyr. So those were some of the things that I wanted to sort of explore as I was working and producing these characters, was sort of taking the reporting experience that I had and weaving it subtly into the story.
May I just follow up, and maybe I can give the question to you. Is there anyone in the novel who's not lonely? Is there anyone I can't think of any of the characters as being part of a kind of a social structure that makes sense and then gives them some form of belonging, apart from the noodle scene that I've just showed you, where the grandmother is giving them food after the protests.
I think you're right that everybody is in somehow a cage, that it's not just by chance, but designed by a system like China, that the China's Communist Party knows its power is coming from organization. And to eliminate any threat, it means making every people become individual atoms, that you do not have a connection. You are not able to forming any meaningful organization, thus it will never become a threat to this very party. Take example for China's cracking down on religious group, the Muslim Uyghurs, the underground Christianity, to the Tibetans, Buddhism. It is not necessary for CCP to anti those religious groups because of the ideology of communism, but they're doing it more from a practical reason, because they believe that if you have an identity, a belief, a religion outside of the Communist Party organization, then you become a threat. And the same logic is applying to LGBT community, queer community. It's because this new identity that being formed, united, will always be seen as a threat.
I think it's also interesting because it's supposed to be a story about three friends and the friendships amongst them, but as you point out, they are all lonely. And as I've had time to think while he's answered, I think without giving away too much, I think the least lonely person is the one in prison later in the book, if you think about it.
Yeah. So I would like to move towards the question of what contemporary or modern China is or could be. And it's a very complex question, I think, for everyone, but especially if you're not too familiar with China and Chinese history. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that question could even mean, why that could even be a question? Just throw in a few words, the diaspora, the question of whether Taiwan or Hong Kong or mainland China do represent a real China, so to speak, the question of family connections that have been there for centuries and were somehow ripped apart. Why does that question even make sense to talk about what the real China is?
I think it's really rich of the Chinese Communist Party to be talking about preserving the traditions and the 5,000 years of history today when they were probably the greatest destroyers as a result of the Cultural Revolution. So much was destroyed. And there is this weird thing, and it happens not just with Chinese exile communities, but you see it with Cuban exile communities, possibly Iranian, I don't know enough, but where if you go to Taiwan and if you go to Hong Kong, a lot more tradition has been preserved. There are just a lot more temples. There are temples to worship various gods. A lot of these traditions, they weren't broken. There was no decade or two where it was completely washed away. And so that's the world I grew up in as someone with a father from Hong Kong and Guangdong province and a mother from Taiwan. And it was actually shocking to me when I first went to China as a correspondent and walking around Beijing. And yeah, you have the visuals of the temples and stuff like that, but I noticed on a day-to-day, like, and how at least the Beijingers I knew celebrated Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, for example, was actually way, what's the word? Way more casual. There was just a lot less stuff and customs, whereas in Hong Kong, it's really hardcore. I mean, you know this. I mean, it's just day one, you do this. Day two, you do this. You have to eat this. You have to do that. And it's very formal. You got to wear, and it was way more casual, and I attribute that to probably, again, the years of Cultural Revolution, poverty as well, and so it's interesting. It's a great question. I don't know the answer, so I'll see what you have to say about that too, but.
Yeah, I think I have a much more cynical perspective on the whole idea of nationalism and culture. I mean, you can imagine growing up in such family that being persecuted by this very government. All my family want me to do is leaving China, to not become Chinese, to become, Aussie in Australia, so that I will not be persecuted. And when I actually left China in 2009, I was having the same idea that I want to escaping from this culture. I want to escaping from this political cage. I want to reinvent myself, not being a prison of an identity, but liberate myself as an individual. However, my idea got shifted a little bit when I get into the Australian Indigenous community and knowing a lot of friends from the Aboriginal community as artists as well, that I feel so envy in a way that they are so proud of their identity and their culture and their history, which for me, I despise the Chinese culture for a very long time because this political cloud which is overshadowing everything. But it's giving me a new perspective to fall in love again with Chinese culture, to appreciate the Chinese paintings, which you will see in the graphic novel. It was actually all digital making, but it was my trying to push it towards to traditional Chinese ink wash style. I mean, I'm still not 100% convincing I would embrace this idea of China completely, because if we really dive into the history of China, it is only a narrative. It's a story saying it is an unstopped continuity of 5,000 years of history. It is actually not. We got conquered by Genghis Khan. We are Yuan dynasty, is totally Mongolia regime. Another great example will be, now the digging of the very origin of Chinese culture becomes such a hot topic. For a place called Sanxingdui, and they find this marvelous bronze sculpture and face mask, and also for the Shang dynasty, which are the very early time for the Chinese culture. But they stop digging and finding more, because the more they're digging in, the more they find the similarity between those so-called Chinese culture are actually traced back to the Middle East, to Egypt. So there's a huge question asking, do we really have an independent origin of the culture, or it's always a mingling and mixture? And this idea of nationalism, the love on the Chinese culture, is really a political tool or the truth. I can understand how important identity could be. For example, for my indigenous friends in Australia, how important identity could be for Taiwanese now when they want, independence. how important for the Uyghurs, for the Tibetans. But if we're still talking with the old-fashioned, the concept of big China, then all of that will not existing. It is not the process to really championing the culture or the aesthetics or the beauty from the history, but it become a political tool to erasing the individuality of the beauty and same valuable things from the history. So that making me questioning myself again whenever the people trying to use China to describe every one of us.
I think I'm very happy for what you've just said, because I feel when you read the novel, it almost seems that there's not that much left for China, right? I mean, I've just shown you the temple that's destroyed. I'm sure that's also a reference to the Cultural Revolution and the destruction of thousands of temples. By the way, this is after Taipei has been hit by a nuclear bomb, so I don't want to spoil anything, but there's references to nationalism. I don't know if you see in the top right, Caspar David Friedrich, Der Wanderer über dem Nebelmeer.
You found one of the Easter eggs.
One of the Easter eggs, yeah. I mean, it ends tragically. German nationalism ends tragically, so there's not much that you leave for nationalism. Religion destroyed, the family, at least ambivalent, because Olivia, who turns out to be a spy for the Communist Party, is being manipulated into being a spy by her boss, with reference to her father and the fact that she has to obey her father to make him happy after his death in 1989. The ideals of democracy are somehow shattered. I mean, the American democracy has turned into some kind of authoritarian state. And there's this one sentence which I really love, is Taiwan is the only place that has a democracy that's worth fighting for. I think that's a very key phrase to this whole novel. There's Granny and the food they enjoy, right? But what's left? Like, where do we move from here? And what are kind of the bits and pieces of identity and of history and of traditions that we can actually rely on?
For me, I always like to come back to individual choices. That in the book, we created a very desperate situation. But the distance between the book is not that far away from our reality. I feel like this is already the world that we're stepping in. And it's desperate. Well, it's desperate because, authoritarian regime like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are so powerful. But it's also desperate because democracy itself is in its huge trouble. That when Donald Trump is elected again in America, when he's cutting all the fundings that's supporting human rights groups globally, that it's not just some organization losing fundings that have to shutting down. Deep down, it is questioning a lot of dissidents from countries like China, like myself, of this belief in democracy and freedom itself. Because we're so used to relying on the successful example in Western countries, in Europe, in America, but there is no guarantee that history will end. And there's so much crisis and trouble is happening. But I think in the end of the day, this is a desperate situation. But it's depending on us as individuals to believing those important values, not just tightening with certain government, politician, or region, but we're really valuing the value itself, to see it as a standing alone treasure that is worth pursuing. I mean, for me, as a Chinese dissident, being working in political arts for more than 15 years, it is so hard because I just don't know. I feel like I'm punching the air for decades and nothing happened. But what makes me continue doing is not because I believe what I'm doing is useful and working, but because I believe what I'm doing is the right thing to do. My favorite hero in the mythology is Sisyphus, who is punished to push the stone to the peak, which is doomed to rolling down. But it's depending on us to define heroism, not with the result, but with the beauty of the action itself. So back to the story, I think our characters struggle in this very desperate situation. It seems like there's no good choice. You have to choose to be silent, or escaping for your safety, or choose to fight. But at what cost? What if it's a violent resistance? What if you have to cost some people, other people's life in order to serving your noble cause? Is that the path you're going to take? Are you ready for that cost? There's no good choices in our story, but it also seems in our world as well. But there is choice for individual to make, and there is burden that we're doomed to carry.
Could I just follow up on that? And would you like to say something? Okay, you said before that Maggie might be the only one who's not lonely, who is free to a certain degree, because she spends most of the novel in a labor camp. These are images also, and this is Maggie, and one of the drawings. What do you mean by that?
Well, without going too much into the details of the book, we wanted to honor, look, we couldn't cover every single group or situation or people or community that's been impacted by China, but one group I was keen on honoring were the Tibetans. In some ways, they've kind of been forgotten. It was a very popular movement in the 90s to support them, including in the West, but we hear less and less of them. And so we brought in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism specifically, as something that drives a couple of the characters, at least, in the book, and that one is Maggie in prison. I should add that our editor was very interesting. He's African American and gave me a lot of homework in terms of watching films and books that came from the world that he knows, which is civil rights movement and things like that. And imprisonment and political transformation is very strong with, for example, Malcolm X, right? And that was also in the top of my mind. I think that's what's actually, I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but like resistance, yes, this book is mostly set in Asia, East Asia, but you know, it was so great to work with an editor like that because you realize it's so universal, right? No matter the context. And so even though this is, you will read it and this is a book set in Asia, there is the Black civil rights movement in there, right, hidden. But I do think that I think about detention a lot, more so than most people, because of the people I've interviewed and thinking of them in detention and what that does to you. And I think that they come out often having found religion, and that helps with their loneliness and also gives them hope. So I think that's where that's coming from. I don't want to give too much away, but there is, freedom is not of the four cells and the four walls of the cell. It is more than that, and I think that was an idea that we were playing around with.
I want to add a little bit on this topic of why Maggie being in prison is less lonely. I think people are truly lonely not because you're only by yourself, but because you're rejected and cannot understand each other in a society. That because your feeling is hurting, and because a government is creating such a society to dissolve the trust between individuals. Like in the Cultural Revolution time, 10 years in China, the children will report their parents to the government to save their own ass. And the same way goes around as well. And China is really a society that people losing trust to each other. That we don't have safety on the food, which is very basic needs. We have a baby's milk formula is poisoned because of corruption and the greediness of companies. So when you're being subject to such society, which is also something we try to picturing in our book, even though you're among 1.4 billion of people, you feel more lonely. But I guess Maggie, who was put into prison and being lucky enough to be guided by Buddhism, and starting to search inside, that facing herself for what she did outside the prison, is somehow a form of twisted fortune as well.
I have another question for you, Melissa, as someone working on the state of democracy, rise in authoritarianism, etc. When we look at these drawings, this is, by the way, the moment that Taipei is being hit by a nuclear bomb. This is a moment where Andy has to decide that he has to kill the pigeon because otherwise the police would hear him and then possibly throw him into a labor camp as well. We see mass surveillance, centralized political control. We see labor camps, nuclear war. Still, I ask, how dystopic is the novel really? If you asked me, I mean, I said it's a 3, but I would now say it's a 2 on a scale from 1 being a realistic novel to being a dystopic novel. I would probably rate it a 2. What's your view on that, also against the background of your work as a correspondent and a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I joke that we call it a dystopian novel, but that's probably for marketing purposes more than anything. I mean, a lot of it is real. A lot of it, I mean, the surveillance, I was surveilled. And frankly, kind of was losing my mind in the final year. I was not consistently surveilled. It progressively got worse. So I have a sense of what it was like. And, you know, they don't surveil everybody in the way they do for foreign correspondents based in China. But it got to a point in the final year where I would fly somewhere, land, and the cars with men would be in the parking lot at the airport waiting for us as we drove off, and they would follow us. Worst case was when I was in Xinjiang, 2 cars with 4 men each followed us for 9 days. And each time we went somewhere, like one of them would go out, so you kind of lose track of the faces for at least the first few days. So I think surveillance it's not an abstract concept for me. And my apartment in Beijing was also, you know, it was very essential. So everything I did in that room, I knew they could if they wanted to. Here, I can't explain to you what that does to you, and I hope my parents aren't watching. But you know, look, I had sex, right? And you're having sex, and you're realize in the middle of it, it flashes in your head that someone could be listening. It is a crazy thing, and you know, I don't talk about it. I mean, you've drawn a lot out of me today, but yeah, I mean, I've never talked about it publicly like this with the camera and everything, but I just want to emphasize just how crazy that is. And so yes, you know, this book is kind of dystopic, but not really. Everything in there, including the prison camp, they exist in China, they exist in many other places around the world. The violence, all of that. What else did you mention? There was
the nuclear war.
Yeah, so the nuclear war hasn't happened, but a lot of research did go into this book, including serious, like, you know, just based on what I understand as a journalist, knowing about international security. So the actual scenario that plays out that leads to this nuclear device being detonated is based off of a war game that was actually run by one of the think tanks in DC. I looked at a number of war games because I did want to do something where I didn't want people to be like, oh, well, this is so fake. So even though it's a work of fiction, a lot of research went into it. There's weird things such as a building getting blown up, to the point that I was talking to friends who were like an architect and asking him structurally, where would the bomb hit the building for it to realistically be impacted? I want to depict it that way. You know, the details of how a Molotov cocktail are actually made. So there's a lot of research that went in so many ways that makes this book not quite as fictional as you would think.
By the way, I think we're just on YouTube, so it's very unlikely your parents will ever look into this.
Oh, I mean, whose parents is on YouTube way too much? Like, so I would say I'm not entirely sure. They're getting the link from the event earlier today and not this one.
I have just 2 or 3 more questions, and one being, if this is a dystopic novel, so to speak, what would the utopic story look like? Where would it be set, and what would the general social conditions look like?
You guys all know Three-Eye Atlas, that interstellar object or comet is flying through our very solar system right now. If I have to make a utopian story, I would say it is actually an alien ship, and it's passing through because it sees how messed up we are as human beings on this planet. And it might just taking out all the dictators once more and giving us a second chance to see how this thing's going on. I think if I have a utopian story, that would be the beginning of it. But there's no guarantee as it developed, it will turn into dystopian again.
I would say a close utopia, and I'm very aware of the problems there, but Taiwan. If we're talking about the Chinese-speaking world as these characters move through, Taiwan is a democracy. It has free press. It has one of the best universal healthcare systems in the entire world. It has the protest. They protest a lot.
It manages to throw its former presidents into jail.
Chen Shui-bian. And, it was the first country in Asia that legalized same-sex marriage. So it's, I think that's the closest to a utopian alternative to this dark book and story.
Let me just ask you one last question, and this is also the last image that I will be showing for tonight. Again, what would you call it? One of the Easter eggs of the story. I'm sure you can all see to the right. It's Maggie holding Andy. Why the reference to Käthe Kollwitz towards the end of the story, and maybe in that context, the use of color, red. I mean, it's mostly black and white. Gray, and then red and yellow. Could you say a little bit something about Käthe Kollwitz and the use of color?
I'll start with the color. As I mentioned earlier, that the art style for this very book is my deliberate choice to mimicking the Chinese traditional ink wash. That is showing my love back to my root and culture. But I also feel it's very important to introducing a very limited color palette, just to make it explode when the emotion is there, when the plot twist is there. The color red and yellow are the major color being used for several pages in this book and also on the cover. And it's very deliberate choices. Red and yellow are actually the color that you will see on China's national flag. And red, particularly, is one of the favorite color for the communist regime from Soviet Union to China to like Vietnam, many other countries. And they somehow able to monopoly the explanation of this very color and only saying it is the color of the revolution or of the communism. But it's not the case. Color is neutral. It should have its freedom to be used in many different ways. It could be the color for Coca-Cola. It could be one of the color on the rainbow flag for the queer community. It could be anything. But in China, sometimes it is not the case. So by using this color in such story that against the China's communist regime is my answer to this monopoly on the color. But also the color of yellow is such a profound symbol for Hong Kong's protest since 2014, when those younger protesters are wearing, yellow umbrella in order defeating the water cannon and tear gas. So all those colors have a very particular meaning and serve a very important role in the entire story.
Can I just interrupt? And I know you want to talk about Käthe Kollwitz, but on the color thing, I think it's interesting because for me, I was really thinking of the palette of Sin City. And I think this speaks to the fact that we are I'm Asian American, but this cannot be called a work of Asian American literature. Badiucao is in Australia. He came from the People's Republic of China. I came from Hong Kong and Taiwan. So this is an Asian diasporic work, and our childhoods were different. We experienced different things. I was exposed clearly to American culture, and so I saw the color palette, and we were discussing the use of color, and I was thinking Sin City. He was thinking about a different set of things. And so I think that's one of the things that we find really interesting to work on the book, is there's no one interpretation, because each of us would come about and arrive at the result of a page from a fundamentally different reference. And I've totally steered it away from Kathy Kollwitz, so over to you.
Wait, let me just interrupt quickly, because one of the kind of references that you don't mention is Chinese mythology, which is, I mean, I started looking into colors of Chinese mythology, and there are obviously a lot of references with regard to red and yellow, you know, the Taoism, the red dust as the kind of chaos of the world, and the yellow emperor Huangdi as like a formative figure of Chinese identity, etc. Both of you didn't mention Chinese mythology. Why not, if I may ask?
I mean, you know, the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, his royal color is not red, it's black. So I would say there's no certain color really occupying the symbol of China, even though now we see it in the Spring Festival. But it's, if we dig deeper, if we truly love the Chinese history, that you will find multiple colors are representing the powers of celebration of death. It has been a change, a mingle, and, you know, returning all the time. I also want to say, you know, the very film of Schindler's List by Spielberg is a masterpiece that using the color in the end. It was black and white for all the film until The Last Umbrella coming out. So yeah, it's a very deliberate using of color, and I want to limit the palette, but only use it on the moment that it really needs it. Back to Kollwitz. I would say she was one of the greatest inspiration of my entire art career. And she actually have a great root in China. Many of you might not know that one of the most greatest left-wing writer from China, whose name is Lu Xun, who is very active during the revolution time. He was actually being credited by Mao Zedong himself, saying he is the greatest writer of China. And he was a big fan of Casey Kollwitz. He personally collected a lot of pieces from her, and then introducing all her art style to the left-wing artist, to a point it became the official art style for the Communist Party after it's taking the power. And then the origin of Kollwitz art that is about pietà, it's about calling for the poverty and the powerless, suddenly turned into propaganda art that they use in the Cultural Revolution. And now, even in North Korea, for their political art, propaganda art, you still can find the trace from Cassie Kollwitz. But I find it's such an assault to her legacy. Thus, when I started doing political cartooning and illustration, I deliberately using the very same style, but try to bring it back to the original status when it is a voice for the powerless. And that's also why there are referencing Cassie Kollwitz in multiple places in this book. That is my tribute to this greatest artist, but I think it's hugely overlooked by the world art history because she's left-wing, because she's a woman.
I think this novel would make a great series. Is this something that might be coming up, Melissa?
You mean as a book?
No, not as a, well, not necessarily. I'm sorry, as a TV series or as a streaming.
Hey, I'll
series.
take an option if it comes with a few thousand. But you know, we're quite realistic because, frankly, I don't think it will be, at least in the United States, because of the commercial structure in which films and television series are made. They're increasingly global, which means that they're very cognizant of not offending certain countries. There's a lot of money, not just from Chinese investment, but also Saudi investment and other autocratic countries with sovereign wealth funds where, I mean, like, think about it. Think about Hollywood. Think about the last film you saw where the bad guys were from China. And I don't think you can think of a single one from the past 10, 15 years at all. That is not an accident. And I think, you know, given this book's nature, which is critical of the United States and China, but I think given the parts on China, I don't anticipate it. Realistically, I mean, maybe in Europe, actually, because it's more likely that there's a little bit more independence funding coming from sort of cultural institutions for a little, like, animated version, which I don't know how that would sort of manifest, but you know, that is something that we were well aware would not be likely to happen as a result of the financing. And it's, again, just to go off on another tangent, it's not just China, right? When was the last time you saw any movie that had like a country, a specific country named as a bad actor? In the Cold War, all the bad guys were Germans and Russians in Hollywood. And, you know, obviously that was ultimately, like, it's problematic because it creates stereotypes and hatred for a group of people. But Hollywood and films now are so denuded of geopolitical context, everything feels ethereal and fake to me. If you look at, like, all the Daniel Craig films of 007, you will struggle to find a specific country named. He'll run through Shanghai and have some adventure, but you know, you just, and that this is deliberate, and that is also another reason why. And a producer actually told me this at one point, very high-level producer. Why do you think, and this is what he said, he was at a human rights conference because in a personal capacity because of his interest, and he said, why do you think everything's set in space now? Because it frees the studios from getting tangled in some way or form to the realities of geopolitics. And I think we really have to think about the way censorship operates in the 21st century, where it's not just sort of in your face, but all the subtle ways in which it plays out.
But even in space, remember the film Gravity? Who saved the American astronaut in the end? The Chinese ones. Why? Because Tencent, the Chinese company, is the major donor to the film. I have a lot of dream for this very book. I want it to be a film, animation. I want it to be a game. I'm talking to the younger generation. But before we achieve this dream, what I really want now is it to be translated into German and published here. And that's something that I need our beloved audience here help to make it happen.
Publishers out there?
You too. Thank you very much for giving us a lot of food for thought. It's an impressive novel. I recommend all of you to buy it. You can buy it outside, by the way. There's a book table. I think you've given us a wonderful insight into what the background of the story is and what different themes there are. And I think we just touched upon 2 or 3. There's many more. There's a lot of Easter eggs hidden all over the book. So I do really encourage you to read it. Follow Badiucao and Melissa Chan. The work you do is wonderful, and it's very, very important. It's wonderful to have had you on stage today. Thank you very much. And by the way, they will be around. We've decided not to take questions, but have the 2 stick around for some time so you can ask them questions personally. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. It was really wonderful to have you here at Literaturhaus. Sonja, thank you so much for hosting us. And I wish all of you a wonderful night, in spite of the fact that we're living in dystopic times. So enjoy the night.
Thank you, Jakob.
Thank you.